Welcome everyone to the EP Pastures Workshop, which is basically the culmination of a 5-year project funded by Rural R&D for Profit, with a lot of partners and organisations. It was running across, or has been running across, Southern Australia, so Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, New South Wales. And on Eyre Peninsula specifically, we had research trials as well as demonstration sites. The main research trials were on the Sardie Minnipa Agricultural Centre, run by Fiona Tomney, and then we also had demonstrations that were managed and sampled by Sardie on Upper EP, and then Andrew Ware of EP AgResearch on Lower EP. So basically this workshop brings in all the information that's gathered throughout the project from the 5 years, as well as having more of a local flavour throughout based on the EP results that we gained over that time. I'm pretty much going to jump straight into the presentations, and first up is Ross Ballard and David Peck from Sardie. Thanks, Ross.
Okay, thanks, Naomi. I'll just share the screen. You could just confirm that that looks okay.
Yep, it was good.
Good. And you can hear me okay?
Yes, loud and clear.
Very good. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for your attendance today. So as Naomi mentioned, we're just going to provide an overview of the Dryland Legume Pasture Systems project. Just like to begin by acknowledging the large cast of people that have contributed to this project over the last 5 years. And we'd also like to acknowledge, as Naomi said, our funding partners, the Australian Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, GRDC, AWI, MLA, and also our research partners, the various grower groups and organisations such as Frontier Farming System that have helped deliver this program. Just a bit of a roadmap of today's presentation. So David and I will talk on some of the current legume options that are available to you, some of the legumes in development, and then I'll follow up with just some legume and rhizobium establishment content as an entree to Bonnie's talk. And then Bonnie and Rick will talk about the establishment and system benefits, and then Andrew Ware will follow up with his local observations of legume performance in the demonstration trials. So we'll talk about two cohorts broadly of legumes today. We'll talk about the traditional pastures such as the annual medics and things like the newly released Seraph. And these legumes, so the annual medics are traditionally harvested by vacuum harvesters. And then we'll talk about the alternative pasture legumes as a cohort. And I guess what brings those together is that they're aerial seeded and retain their seed. So they have the potential for harvesting with a conventional header for reuse back on farm. And I guess the two questions that we're asking within the project is, now, how do these alternative legumes stack up against the more traditional legumes in terms of their performance and their potential to be established in novel establishment systems? Naomi mentioned that there's a range of trials. So we've had some 20-odd trial sites across the lower rainfall, so less than 400 millimetre mixed farm farming systems from Wirrala over to Midiamo in Victoria. So we're going to try and provide you, rather than focusing on specific sites, some broader outcomes of the project across those range of environments. And noting that 4 big systems trials were undertaken across the 5 years at Minnipa, Waikerie, Lameroo and Piangil, and Bonnie will focus a little bit more on those later on. So with that, and the magic at technology, I'm going to disappear and David Peck should appear. There we go.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. So I'll run through some annual pasture legume options. So first, just to set the scene of what is a lay pasture, so people who are familiar with lay pastures will recognise this as a typical lay pasture scene. In this case, medics have come back from hard seed reserves after 2 or 3 years of crops. It's got high quality feed, high protein feed, which is just perfect for this livestock here, namely lactating ewes and lambs that are actively growing. But the other big reason, and later on we'll touch more on this, is the farming systems benefits that these pasture species can give. They can give big benefits to the following crops. So the principal trait for lay pasture cultivars are the ability to persist through several crops. So just to give you a bit of a history lesson so that we can introduce a bit more into these alternatives and understand them a bit more. So way back in the 40s, barrel medics were taken up quite widely by the farming community. Sometime in the late 50s, strand medics became an option. So you might be familiar with Harbinger. And then later on, disc medics. And in the 70s, we had burr medics. And I should say spineless burr medics came on board. So by the 70s, we had our major species in medics that are growing. And then in the late 70s, aphids turned up. And so we had aphid introductions, which were followed by lines that were bred for aphid resistance. So then to the right, we've all got bred lines. So we got softer burrs to have more early dry matter. We had the SU tolerant herbicide residues medics, and then we've got the powdery mildew resistant medics coming along now, and right there on the right is a spineless barrel medic. So if we move down to the alternatives, on the left in the late 50s, yellow Cerodellas first appeared. It's in pink because they weren't widely adopted at that point in time. So in the late 80s, French Cerodella turned up. At that point in time, all the French Cerodellas were soft, so they're not suitable for lay pasture systems. But from the late 90s onwards, there was a range of alternative species that were taken up and gradually over time started to hit reasonable sized areas, first in WA and then later in New South Wales. So you had Bicerula, land clover, Margarita, French Cerodella, the first hard-seeded French Cerodella, bladder clover, and through the DeLips project, you've got Frano, which is earlier than Margarita. So just in summary, the alternatives, there's only come along in the last 1 or 2 decades. They're less sophisticated because by and large, the one cultivar is only being released. So in this project in particular for our alkaline soils, we were starting to understand if these have got a role to play in our soils. They were largely developed for acidic soils, but let's see how far they can move. So just an example of breeding in strand medics in this case. So we got Harbinger in 1959, well-adapted accession collected from overseas. Then the aphids came along, which is a serious constraint. So we did back cross breeding to bring aphid resistance in. There was then 2 lots of mutation breeding, which is one for the SU herbicide tolerance and one for pod holding. And then down the bottom in purple, we've suddenly changed from our just overcoming a constraint to focusing on agronomy as well. So in this case, our focus was powdery mildew resistance, but our powdery mildew resistant parent also had very good agronomy. So we could select heavily for dry matter at the same time as we were selecting for our traits. So Seraph was released in 2021. It's got very good soil adaptation to alkaline soils. It's early flowering. It's got ideal hard seed levels. It's blue-green aphid resistance. It's SU herbicide residue tolerant. And it's also powdery mildew tolerant. So just to give you some more information on Seraph. So on the top right-hand corner, you can see Seraph is all green and lovely, whereas Angel is heavily covered with powdery mildew. The bottom right, you can see Seraph growing in the grazing trial at Minnipa. And in the left, which is the figure, this is the real data. So across 15 sites, in this figure is where SU residues or powdery mildew was not present. Seraph on average gave 15% higher dry matter across those 15 sites. And it also gave a slight increase in seed yield. So just an example of SU tolerance. So the SU tolerance was first in Angel, and this is a typical picture. So the SU herbicide residues can persist at damaging levels for 1 to 5 years. 2 years after SU herbicide application, there's been reports of 75% reduction in dry matter, whereas the SU tolerant cultivars can tolerate those residues. They do not tolerate the full label rate, so it is all about the residues. So the current medic cultivars that are tolerant to SU residues are Sultan SU, Seraph, Jester SU, and Penfield. So this line here, this slide here has got a lot of information, but on the left is a checklist for me when I've got my breeder's hat on. It's also a checklist when I've got my evaluation hat on it. So when we deliver a cultivar to you, they will get a pass mark on all those, but you still should be aware of these, and because some things might be more important to you than others. So seed, the ability to harvest the seed and how to use it in early vigor is important. The seasonal herbage production and the nitrogen fixation, of course, is important. Time of flowering is important. So you need to match the time of flowering to your rainfall class. So many of these alternative ones are later flowering than the earlier medics. So you need to be aware of that, particularly if you come from a very dry area. Seed production is important for the regeneration. It needs to be suitable to livestock. You would take that as a given, but you might be aware, you might have some spiny naturalized burmedics that are causing problems to you, whereas we always release spineless burmedics. And if you're interested in Bicerula, you need to be aware that it can cause a phytosensitization. So you need to be on the lookout for that and be prepared to pull the stock out if need be. Number 6 is probably a really important point. Is it suitable to your soil type or your soil constraints? It needs to have suitable hard seed levels, and at least in the medics, some of them are tolerant to pests and diseases. So in the blue one is a bit, summarizes this a bit more. So you need to ask yourself, what is your rainfall? Does it match a cultivar that you're interested in? When does the season start? When does it finish? And in particular, the soil type, the pH of your soil and the texture of the soil will help decide what species are likely to be suitable for you. So any cultivar, a failure to pass one or more of the above equals potential poor performance on your farm. So this is just an example of some soil adaptation things. So here we have at Minnepa in the foreground, you've got French Serradella not liking the alkaline soils at Minnepa. So this is not necessarily a surprise because the French Serradella, its initial claim to fame was deep acid sands. So to restate, rainfall is important, your soil type, your texture, your pH, not so much for this talk, but drainage is also important, the ability to tolerate waterlogging. And what cropping system do you need to do? So if you're having a lay system, you need to ensure that the cultivars that you're interested in do have suitable hard seed levels. So species may have traits that you want, so the ability to harvest pods and summer sow, which Bonnie will talk on, but if it's not suited to your soil type, it will not be successful. So if you're interested in a new species, we're suggesting you sow small areas, potentially up and down a slope, and that'll allow the new species to experience a range of pH and soil textures. And you can then evaluate what part of the landscape they have a fit for you. So previously we showed a picture of French Serradella, and the two figures on the left, the alkaline loam and the sandy loams, once again, the medics have outperformed the Serradella. But on the right, at a neutral sand at speed, you can see that the French Serradella well and truly outperformed the medics. So these type of results here is why there's potential to pay attention to some of these alternative species. So the regeneration after crop is also important. So this gets back to hard seed levels. So when I'm doing my breeding for medics, I aim for a hard seed level in the first autumn of 70 to 90% because that allows them to go pasture, but it also allows them to regenerate after crop well. So on the left, we've got Seraph medics. So the ones to the right haven't regenerated as well as the medic. So you probably miss out on a bit of early growth, but Sardi Rose, Bladder Clover and French Ceradella, by spring, you'll certainly have high dry matter and high feed available. Whereas the Trigonella on the right, we have decided that one is too soft and will not meet our requirements. So we've got a traffic light system to try and give some summaries of all these species. So right on the left column, we're saying alkaline soils. So because we're talking to the EP at the moment. So you can see barrel medics, strand medics and burr medics have a very long history of performing well on alkaline soils. The Ceradellas, French and yellow Ceradella, we got the red against them because they certainly don't like alkaline soils, and particularly when you're picking up free lime. The Bicerula doesn't like alkaline soils, whereas the bladders, the rose and the arrow leaves can probably tolerate more alkaline soils than the other alternatives. But if you've got an acid soil in your paddock somewhere that you're worried about, you can certainly flip those colours around. So suitable hard seeds, we touched that on before in the previous figure. So some of them we think are a little bit too soft, some of them we think are a little too hard. So the next column is the ability to harvest your own seed. So the Ceradellas, they can well and truly be harvested. Probably 70% to more of their seeds can be harvested. Some of the other ones in yellow, you can probably, timing is a little bit more important, but you can probably harvest 50% or more of those ones. So up in the medics, we have got them in pink rather than deep red. So we have done some preliminary work on harvesting medic pods, and in your Eyre Peninsula farming systems, you'll see an article on that. So next one is the tolerant of the SU residues. So there's only two options there, which is the barrels and the strand medics. Same with aphid resistance. Same if you're particularly boron is an issue for you. So going over to the right is the budworm. So if you're growing French Ceradella, you need to monitor that and you need to spray for that if you observe them. So then matching flowering times, we touched on this before. All the alternative ones are a little bit later than the medics, and arrowleaf is somewhat later again. So the summary of current legume options. Medics overall perform the best on the neutral to alkaline soils. Alternative legume species, which have been largely developed in WA and the acid soils, they can be aerially harvested. They can perform well. So start targeting at least acidic to neutral soils. And we're suggesting you test small areas up and down the slope to experience a range of soil textures and pHs. So I'm now moving on to some of the legumes cultivars that are in development. So 2 new barrel medics cultivars will be available this autumn. So this isn't from the LIPS work, it's rather from a project with MLA and S&W Seed Company. So on the left, we've got the new barrel medic cultivar called Emperor. It is very similar to Pareggio, but it has got powdery mildew resistance. So on the right, we have got a new spineless barrel medic called Penfield. So its #1 claim is the fact that it's spineless. So if you're particularly pursuing high quality wool, you might consider this. Alternatively, if you've been growing some of the burr medics because you value the spineless trait, Penfield might give you more options. It might be better suited to your soil, and it's got more traits. It's got boron tolerance, it's got aphid resistance, it's got the SU tolerance. So some of the lines that we have developed under the LIPS, which we will be reviewing in a month or two and working out which ones get a jersey for the main game and which ones don't. But up on the top right, we're working on some disc medics with the improved ability to fix nitrogen. So you can see the 4 pots in the middle aren't growing as well on this particular strain of Rhizobium, whereas on the left is the donor parent and on the right is our selections. They're growing better than those middle lines across a whole range of different Rhizobium strains. So in the bottom is some of our spineless burr medic work. Like I said before, none of the burr medics are boron tolerant, so we're trying to overcome that. And on the right, red-legged earth mites can be quite a pest for pastures. Less insecticide options are suddenly being available to you. So that is one of the things that we were reading for. So we're also working on some aerial seeded options that we think have got a more of a chance of performing in our alkaline soils. So Trigonella, which is a new species, I showed you before that it wasn't hard enough, so we have bred lines that are harder. It's going through some CSIRO duty of care work where we are making sure that animals grow well on it and there's no problems in regards to either the animal or the taste of the meat. So another one we're working on the bottom right is an arrow leaf. We're trying to develop lines that are earlier, and we're picking up at the moment 30% more dry matter. So in WA, where they grow lots of bladder, they have working on an earlier bladder, and that will be coming out through the DLIPS program. Handing back to Ross.
Okay, thank you, David. So I'll just round out this session, a little bit of information on legume establishment in Rhizobium. And we'll begin with the Rhizobium. I guess the first point I'd just like to make is that if you're growing these species, just make sure if you're inoculating yourself that you use the right strain of Rhizobium. And I'll just note that there is a new inoculation manual out that we've just revised. It's available on the GRDC website. If you Google inoculating legumes practice and science, it will come up as the first hit, and it provides comprehensive information on all the pasture legumes and the inoculant strains to use on them. Just briefly looking at the different inoculant groups. So the annual pasture legumes have specific requirements for their Rhizobium. There's two groups for the medics. So if you're growing strand and disc, make sure you use the AL inoculant group. All other annual medics use AM, and that's important to optimise the amount of nitrogen fixation occurring with those medics. The annual clovers are all serviced by the Group C strain, WSM 1495, and the, sorry, that's not, 1325 is that particular strain for Group C. We see some issues with vetch and medics with people getting confused with which inoculant strain to use because they're grown in similar environments and they look a little bit the same. Sometimes people use the medic inoculant on vetch, but they are two separate inoculants. So vetch is inoculated with Group B or F. The Ceradella is inoculated with S, but can also be inoculated with Group G. Because both Ceradella and lupin use the same Rhizobium species, there are just subtle differences between the strains. And finally, Bicerula is a unique inoculant strain, and because it hasn't been grown for very long in Australia, it always will need inoculation in South Australia and Victoria, and there is a specific inoculant, and it is best inoculated at a higher rate as well. Just a few dot points on each of the legume groups and the likelihood of inoculation response. So medic and to some extent Trigonella, which is related to the medics, the Rhizobia for these will be already common in soils with a recent medic history, particularly where the soil pH is high. But having said that, we still see inoculation responses commonly in the SA Vic Mallee. And that's for two reasons. It's because the medics, the time between medics has tended to be increased between medic pastures in those environments, and also soil pH has declined. So those factors together are meaning there are a number of soils that are now responsive. In the medic space, the naturalised soil Rhizobia are less effective than the inoculant Rhizobium, but they are very difficult to replace. And in that front, as David said, we are looking in the longer term to develop and release some what we're calling promiscuous medics, which will have less fussy requirements in terms of their rhizobium. And finally, just to note that the strand medics, so things like Jaguar, Angel, and our recently released Seraph, tend to have fewer nodules. That's just a characteristic of the plant. You usually only see 5 to 10 nodules, so don't be too worried about that. In the clover space, most soils also contain naturalised rhizobium, but having said that, specifically bladder and gland clovers only see a proportion of those soil rhizobium. And so they are still highly responsive to inoculation. So if you're growing bladder or gland, make sure you inoculate with the Group C rhizobium inoculant. Serradella, a little bit more specific in its symbiosis, and there will be no rhizobium in the soil if either it or lupin have not been previously grown. Those rhizobia tend to be tolerant of acidic soils. They are most tolerant of acidic soils, but the symbiosis is intolerant of free lime. And you see the little picture on the right-hand side, that's just some Serradella growing at Mount Compass, and it's got high pH induced chlorosis. Our recommendation is that if you are going to try Serradella, try growing it in paddocks where you previously had lupin. That will ensure you've got a good population of rhizobium in the soil. And if you've grown lupin successfully, it's also a good indication that Serradella will grow successfully as well on that soil type. Finally, with Bicerula, the rhizobium are very specific, almost certain to be absent. So inoculate and use higher rates. Okay. Just leading into Bonnie's presentation, I'll just talk a little bit about pasture establishment. And just to keep in mind that the main aim in the establishment year is really to achieve high seed set, because that sets up the pasture for long-term persistence. And there's 3 main levers you can pull: the seeding rate, timing of seeding, and seeding depth. And I'll just briefly talk about those leading into Bonnie's talk. So this just demonstrates the importance of seeding rate for an autumn sowing pasture using soft seed, so a conventional establishment system. And you can just see that the time to accumulate a couple of thousand kilos of dry matter is out at beyond 100 days if you use 1 kilogram of seed, whereas if you use 10 kilograms of seed, that's back around 80 days. So it's recommended that sowing rates in conventional systems are in the 5 to 10 kilo range for the annual medics in particular, but we know that 2 to 5 kilos often used. But if you're looking for quicker pasture establishment and you want to graze those pastures in the first year, then upping your sowing rate is just one simple way you can do that. And just to note that a regenerating pasture is the equivalent often of about more than 50 kilograms of germinable seed per hectare. Timing of seeding is also important, and there has been a significant amount of work about these novel practices of late summer sowing. These are more widely used in WA and New South Wales and largely centred around Serradella and bladder clover. And they're reliant on sowing hard seed in summer that breaks down. The benefits of this approach is that if you can harvest the seed, you can plant it late in summer so you don't have this clash when you're sowing crops. And the other big advantage is it provides earlier feed than a conventional sowing in some environments. And so we're examining the concept within the project of whether summer sowing can be used for species such as medic and how that works in our environments. Just one thing to consider in the summer sowing space is that you do need higher sowing rates, and just a little bit of basic maths here, just to underscore that point. So French Ceradella, if you're sowing pod, summer sowing, only about 50% of that pod is seed. And of that seed in the pod, we would expect because it's hard, we would expect about 60% of it to soften by the break of season. So if you're sowing Ceradella pod, to achieve an equivalent of 5 kilograms of germinable seed, you've actually got to sow 17 kilograms of pod. If you're targeting 10 kilos of seed, you need to sow 33 kilos of pod, and that's about the levels that Bonnie has used to set up her trials. Now, the medics are even require greater amounts if we assume that only 33% of the pod is seed and 20% softens. To achieve a level of around 5 kilos of germinable seed, you would need to sow about 75 kilograms of pod. Now, we're not saying that we would recommend sowing that rate, but we're just making the point that in these summer sowing practices, you've got to put more seed out there to get equivalent results. And just to summarise the whole presentation, so as David said, across the range of alkaline neutral soil environments, the medics have been most reliable in terms of both their production and their regeneration after crops. The other legumes can do well in certain situations, but they have to be on the right soil and in the right rainfall environment. And also consider persistence, where we know the medics will regenerate after a couple of seasons of crop. The regeneration of some of these alternatives have been less reliable. There are 2 new releases with good amounts of seed available this year. They are Seraph-Matic and Frano Ceradella. So if you want to give those a try them on suitable soil types. And there's several further releases planned. We'll see those trickle out over the next 2 or 3 years. And finally, just think about your seeding rates in terms of maximising your early production. And if you're going to try some of the summer sowing, certainly those seeding rates will need to be increased. So I will leave it there. I'll just unshare the screen.
Thank you, Ross and David. That's a really good potted history and summary of performance of medics. I'll open it up to questions in a sec if anyone's got one, but I've got one and I'm butting in first. So the strand medics, you said, have fewer nodules on the plant generally, with the newer ones. So do they still fix the same amount of N, still high performing in that regard?
Yeah, look, I think across the pasture legumes, the medics are pretty consistent in their fixing 65 to 80% of their N. But I've actually been looking at some of the data from the Minipa grazing trial in the last week or so, and I think there's still certainly opportunity to improve that level more. But I guess if you're asking, are the 5 nodules enough on the strand medics, that's just the characteristic of the plant, and they work at a good level of efficiency. So in that regard, they match the equivalent of the other medics, Naomi. Yep.
Thanks, Ross. Did anyone else have any questions for Ross or David on the species? Josh has popped one up, just wondering what the source for the sowing rate by biomass accumulation chart and where this was done.
David?
So this is 70s work here at Adelaide based on baromedics. So it's just basic physiology type questions that they were asking at that point in time. So it also, similar type of work was done at that point in time that's related to seed set. So that's questions for the seed growers. So if you're going to graze your plants in that first year, we recommend that you remove the plants, remove your livestock at the first sign of flowering in order to maximise your flower seed set.
And Kevin submitted a question, what's the ideal number or range of nodules per medic and vetch plants?
Okay, so as we've mentioned, the strand medics would be looking at about 8 weeks after after emergence, we'd be looking at 5 to 10 nodules. For the other medics, we would be looking at more than a minimum of 20 nodules per plant. And vetch, you jump up again. Vetch, we would be looking for more than 50 nodules per plant. And vetch is just very good in its ability both to nodulate and fix nitrogen.
And just another one here. Feed quality results and digestibility of Seraph compared to other options. How did that perform?
Yeah, look, we have some quite detailed results from the Minipa grazing trial, and both the Seraph has performed well in terms of its dry matter digestibility. Very little difference between the species in that regard at when they are vegetative or senescent, all very similar. Some differences in crude protein, but generally the levels are above the point of any limitation. Having said that, again, coming back to the Minipa trial, we are seeing some protein limitations in the livestock performance on the stubbles, wheat stubbles following the pasture, but that's more a function of, I believe, just not getting enough nitrogen into the system. I don't think it's a particularly a limitation specific to any one cultivar. It's more just we need to get more N into the system. But generally, to answer the question, I mean, feed quality of Seraph in terms of digestibility and crude protein is good.
Good, thank you. Last chance for questions before we jump into Bonnie with the establishing or evaluation of the establishment methods. I think we're all good to go. Take it away, Bonnie. Thanks.
To go? Yep, you can hear me and see everything okay?
Yep, good sound and picture.
Great. Okay, hi everyone. Thanks for joining in today. Today I've got 3 parts to my talk. I'm talking about the establishment methods that Ross mentioned, followed by the crop benefits of including a legume pasture in the cropping rotation. And then Rick Llewellyn is going to be talking about the economics side of things. It's not moving forward for you guys.
No.
Oh, there we go. It just was a bit of a delay there.
Oh, yeah, you're good.
All good. Yeah, so I'd like to acknowledge the Rural R&D for Profit program and the funding from the Australian Government, MLA, AWA and GRDC. I'd also like to acknowledge the collaborators who have contributed to this work I'm presenting today and the landholders for hosting the experiments. So before we can get into talking about these establishment methods, we know what really drives production of crops and is when the seasonal break occurs. And so part of our modelling part of this project was to try to define when the seasonal break was occurring for where we would have best fits of early establishment opportunities. So to do that, we looked at historic climate data from 1971 to 2018, and we opened the sowing window from the 1st of March to the 30th of July. And a sowing opportunity was triggered when the sum of the 7-day rainfall was greater than the sum of the 7-day evaporation. So by applying that rule, we came up with this map on this slide, and you can see it generally follows seasonal rainfall distribution patterns. So in Western Australia and South Australia, where we have a more Mediterranean rainfall patterns, we have a later seasonal break compared to the eastern states, where you can see they're really getting those early sowing opportunities. So this is useful because it can provide farmers, breeders and researchers with regional information regarding tactical cultivar and management decisions. So to zoom in on some sites of the experiments where I'm talking about today, the median seasonal break ranged from the 1st of May to the 24th of May. And the range in the seasonal break was between 40 and 56 days, so highly variable. And the rainfall that triggered the sowing opportunity ranged between 20 and 30 millimetres, which I think aligns quite well with how we think of the seasonal break happening on the ground. So I'm talking about 3 experiments today based in Waikerie, Lameroo and Piangil. So Ross gave quite a nice explanation of summer sowing, but to have it here on a figure, you can see we compared twin sowing, which was when we sowed hard or unsclarified pasture seed with the previous year's crop. And this hard seed broke down for a whole growing season to establish on the following year's seasonal break. Then we compared this to summer sowing, which Ross talked about, and that is when the hard or unsclarified pasture seed is sown in February of the year that you want it to establish. And that hard seed breaks down over autumn to establish on the seasonal break. And these were compared to autumn sowing, which is the traditional method of sowing soft or sclarified pasture seed into moist soil after the seasonal break. So you can see there's potential there for earlier grazing with twin and summer sowing if you get that earlier break. And also there's potential for sowing not to clash with the main sowing program of the cropping system. So the species that we grew in these experiments had not been traditionally grown in the area, but they have shown success in novel establishment methods in Western Australia, and they also have potential for on-farm harvesting of seed. So Ross has gone into the details of some of these species, so I won't be focusing on that today, but we grew strand medic, bladder clover, French ceradella, Trigonella balanci, and rose clover. So for each site, I'm going to present a peak biomass figure with the species on the x-axis, and the number written above each column is the establishment number of the pasture species. So blue is autumn sown, pink is summer sown, and grey is twin sown. So in 2019 in Waikerie, we had a below average growing season, and the seasonal break occurred on the 9th of May, which was bang on the median seasonal break of our analysis. So this meant that everything basically established on the same date. So we didn't get that early biomass production. And the numbers show that everything established quite well at Waikerie, but generally production was very low. And this was a combination of a low rainfall growing season and also the soil type not being suitable to many of these species. So strand medic was the highest biomass producer here. And I've got a star there next to the vetch because that was damaged by some kangaroos. So the biomass for the vetch was expected to be higher there. So in the following growing season, everything, all of these treatments were sown to wheat to see if there was any yield advantage of including the legume pastures, and we didn't find a significant wheat grain yield at this site. So next we had Piangil. So in the same growing season, it had a similar very low rainfall site, but the biomass production was higher. The seasonal break occurred slightly earlier, but not much. And this also aligned well with our seasonal break analysis. So again, everything established on the same date. So there's not huge differences between twin and summer sowing. But so the site had greater success with summer and twin sowing, as you can see by the biomass competing with the autumn sown biomass quite well. And at this environment, Ceradella was able to compete with Strand Medic quite well, but Vetch had the highest biomass out of all the legumes. So I also put a few 2021 regeneration numbers here from this experiment. Similar to the Wakery experiment, everything was sown to wheat after the after the pasture phase. And interestingly, regeneration was reasonably well for everything after the cereal phase with greater than 200 plants per metre square. However, the Ceradella had lower than expected emergence after the cropping phase. So there is some uncertainty if the Ceradella can persist in the cropping phase. So we repeated these experiments in another growing season at the Lameroo site. So in this growing season, we had a really above average rainfall with 343 mils. And we also got an earlier break. So we saw some differences between the autumn, summer and twin sowing. So bladder and trigonella had the highest pasture production and establishment for both autumn and summer sowing. And rose clover and Ceradella, while they established quite well, under autumn sowing, their production was generally low. And this says to us that they are less suitable to the Lameroo environment. So as you saw, there was quite a bit of difference or variability between the success of the summer and twin sowing between Wakery, Piangil and Lameroo. And the question that came to mind was this purely driven by the species suitability to those environments, or was it also associated with depth caused by furrow collapse with summer and twin sowing? So to investigate the effect of depth on emergence, we grew all the past, not all of them, sorry, we only grew bladder clover, medic, Ceradella and trigonella at 1, 3 and 6 centimetre depth. And we found that anything greater than 3 centimetre depth reduced emergence by about 50%. So seeding depth is really important consideration, and unless confident in where that seed is going, I wouldn't recommend the twin sowing unless that's got depth control on the seeder. So we did a similar experiment for vetch, and we grew the vetch at greater depths though, so from 5 to 16 centimetres. And we found there was no significant difference in emergence, but there was a biomass penalty. So that suggests that we can go quite deep with vetch though. So following on from that Lameroo experiment, it leads in a bit to the next part of my talk about cropping benefits, but it's an interesting piece of data. So following on from the pasture treatments, everything was sown to wheat again. And this was in 2021 at Lameroo, and we had a decile 2 growing season. But at the start of the growing season, under the brown manure vetch treatments, we had an additional 30 millimetres of water compared to continuous cereal. So that's the bottom figure there. With the pastures, autumn sowing tended to have the higher soil moisture, and this was driven by fewer weeds under autumn sown. And there was also an additional 70 kilos of nitrogen under brown manure vetch at sowing compared to the continuous cereal, which is the top figure there. So it had quite a bit more soil mineral and at sowing. But there are a couple of important key considerations here when comparing the vetch to the pasture system here, and that's that the pastures were left to set seed. So they would have used more water than the vetch. And also at the time of sampling for nitrogen, it was possible that the vetch residues had broken down more than the pasture residues, leading to a greater soil mineral end under vetch. But the truth was really in the wheat yield at harvest, and the brown manure treatments yielded 1.5 tons more yield than the continuous cereal treatments. The pasture treatments yielded an additional 7.7 tonne per hectare of yield, while also establishing a seed bank. So the pasture seed set at this site for the best treatments was about 1 tonne per hectare. We haven't had a seasonal break yet here at Lameroo for the 2022 growing season yet, but we will be getting those establishment numbers when that happens. So we just wanted to summarise these 3 experiments visually. So red highlights that there was poor establishment and poor growth. Orange highlights that it either established well, but the biomass was low, or it suggests that it grew well in one experiment, but not the other. And you can see that by the notes there. So really this just highlights the uncertainty around twin sowing and the suitability, the importance of choosing the right variety for trialling these establishment methods. So as I mentioned, some of these species were interested in the harvestability of the seed, and Michael Moody at Piangil did a experiment on this in the 2020 growing season. And what he found here was that the species that were able to be harvested with a conventional harvester were Trigonella and Margarita, with between 35 and 44% of the seed being able to be harvested. Sorry, that number there next to the column is the total seed harvested. So just to conclude this part of my talk, summer sowing worked well for some species, but differed across environments. The seasonal break timing is a limitation for adoption of novel sowing methods in this area, but there's still the benefit of sowing occurring outside of the main sowing program. Autumn sowing was the most reliable for all species. And I haven't gone into the weed data today, but twin and summer sowing had a greater number of weeds compared to autumn sowing, and that's associated with not being able to get a knockdown on summer weeds when putting these methods in place. And unless confident in seeding depth, placement, and there's no furrow infill, twin sowing isn't recommended until this is addressed. So I'm shifting gears a little bit. So the next part of my talk is about the pasture cropping system benefits. So ley farming systems offer an avenue to increase soil nitrogen, and we've seen a snippet of that in the previous part of my talk. The modern ley farming system needs to evolve to remain economically competitive against a rapidly evolving annual cropping system. So this reevaluation of pasture cropping systems has sparked an investment in a new generation of the annual legume species and their suitability to a range of environments. So while we're aiming for low cost regenerating options, can they compete with vetch in our evolved cropping system? So I'll be showing some yield results from sites I've already talked about, with Minipir in there as well. And so there were either 1 or 2 pasture year phases, and these were all sown to wheat in 2020. So we could capture everything of the yield response in that year. So firstly, just to summarise at each site, the legume production in 2019, vetch tended to have the highest biomass at Lameroo, Minipir and Piangil, with the next biomass coming from Strand Medic. At Minipir and Piangil, there were other options there that could compete with the Strand Medic for biomass. So just to zoom in on vetch and medic and the continuous cereal treatments only, the mean medic pasture break effect was an additional 1.1 tonne per hectare, and grain protein was increased by 0.7%. And a lot of this was driven by the soil mineral nitrogen. So there was a mean increase in available nitrogen was 42 kilos per hectare and 35 kilos per hectare after vetch and medic respectively. I wanted to show some end fixation data for the different legume species. We've got this measured in 2018 and 2019. And so the vetch and field pea, had the greatest end fixation of a single year legume, which was 46 kilos per hectare. And the legume pastures sort of ranged between 7 for a single year Ceradella or 44 for a regenerating medic. And the point I wanted to make with this figure, so we're seeing wheat yield here with the different legume treatments on the x-axis at the Lameroo site, that as long as the legume is reasonably well adapted, the yield benefit the following year is likely to be similar. So this is the yield response at the Lameroo site in particular was correlated with the nitrogen post the legume break. So this figure is showing the removed nitrogen, which includes grain and stubble, against the available nitrogen, which is the pre-sow nitrogen and the end supply potential. And while the yield response was largely related to nitrogen, there's also other factors at play, as you can see by the barley point here on the figure. So this suggests that there's other factors outside of nitrogen contributing to the yield response, likely to be disease and soil water. So now I'm going to hand over to Rick, who is going to talk about the economic perspective on investing in new legume pastures.
All right, we'll flow straight on. Thanks, Bonnie. You'll have to flick through the slides. So just go on to the next one there. So we'll talk about two levels. The first one I'll call paddock scale, but really it's plot scale. So it's taking a return on investment approach. Been doing a fair bit of that with the soil amelioration practices, and I think it's an interesting way to think about the pasture investment as well, especially when you see some of the sort of 4-year results, the returns over 4 years. And when you see that, we'll have the cost of establishment plus some of the potentially foregone profit in those establishment years. And we'll include some farm scale where some of the grazing benefits can be taken into account a little bit better through Midas modelling that Marta Longidino has done. So just go ahead there, Bonnie. So this is the return on investment. So this is from the Lameroo trial that Bonnie's already presented. And if you look at it, you're sort of starting off with a 2-year medic phase to get these new medics established in this case, and we've done it for other species as well. So it's quite a costly. Obviously, the establishment cost is not getting below $300. That reflects the fact that you could have grown a very profitable cereal crop in those years. And in this trial, we didn't actually graze, so you've got to consider that as well. You can see peas there also had an opportunity cost as well. It only yielded half a tonne in 2019, I think it was. So you could have made more if you had stuck with cereal. So what you see though is because of those great returns compared to continuous cropping, continuous cereal in this case, you see over the next 2 years, 2020 and 21, you're well into the black, and it's actually a pretty strong return on investment from those establishment years. And it ends up being right up there next to the brown manure vetch and the peas in rotation. That's even without grazing. If you just go ahead, Bonnie. Now, I've had to make this up basically because to introduce what some modest grazing could have been. I mean, I didn't want to assume too much grazing pressure because there was a lot of crop benefit from that legume biomass. So you can see even just assuming a very light grazing in year one, $50 hectare return and a little bit, still reasonably modest, I think, with current prices, $150 hectare return from livestock grazing, sheep grazing in the second year of the pasture. You can see it's ending up well ahead. So that's And of course, the big bonus is that at the end of all this, you've got the pasture seed bank, which has got the ongoing value. So that's what the next scenario is really looking at. When you have got, just go ahead, Bonnie, when you've got that regenerating pasture seed bank of the new pastures across the whole farm, in this case, possibly part of a farm, 1,500 hectares of sandy loam in this Midas scenario that Marta's run with input from Ross and David. You've got regenerating pastures. They're regularly sown, so the average annual legume pasture cost, when you include the establishment years, every 4 or 5 years, I think it is, plus the regenerating years management, averages out at around $65 a hectare. So the new improved medic, such as Seraph, compared to a benchmark medic, a standard medic, it raises the average. We've assumed it can raise the average legume percentage up to 70% from 48. So even the standard medics are a pretty reasonable medic pasture. And you're raising pasture production up substantially as well, from around a tonne up to 1.3. And we've got vetch in there as well as a forage. That only assuming 1.1 biomass based on the results we got. And that there are 160 annual costs of establishing that every year, of course. If you just go ahead, we'll quickly look at some results. So when you take it out to this whole farm scale, that's leading to a 25% increase in whole farm profit on average, from shifting to that much improved pasture above the standard pasture. Barrel medics back there as well. I think that led to about a 10% pasture profit improvement compared to the original standard, if you can get it up to that 70% of the sward. So the profit maximising pasture, I think this is important. You're sort of achieving this without going outside of what's still a crop dominant system. So you're really only going from 10 to 15% pasture up to 20 to 25% pasture. So you're achieving it without drastically reducing your crop area. 40% of the land ends up with a pasture in rotation. Typically that's a pasture phase followed by wheat and barley. That's the profit maximising or optimal rotation in the model. This is an optimising model. And stocking rate to capitalise on this extra growth and quality is increasing by about 1 DSE per farm hectare. Vetch still perform well. I mean, like I said, that standard medic assumption is a reasonable medic pasture, and it's far more profitable, 20% more profitable than continuous cropping. So vetch is a little bit behind, but if you had other issues, if you had concerns about even establishment and appreciate the flexibility of vetch, it's still a strong performer there, but nowhere near as good in terms of whole farm profit as much improved medics. And it's worth just mentioning bladder. It's not really an option yet, like Ross mentioned, but it did, because of the high digestibility, which is a big driver in this economics, it did lead to a 15% increase above the standard. So that's just worth keeping in mind, these options with the higher digestibility. I think that's all I was going to mention, Bonnie. We'll switch back to the general conclusions if you want to run through those. Bonnie.
Damn it, knew I was going to do that once. So just to summarise the cropping benefits part of the talk. So the mean wheat yield after the medic pasture was 1.1 tonne per hectare, and grain protein was increased by 0.7% compared to the continuous cereal treatment. At Lameroo, the 2-year pasture phase yielded higher than the single-year brown manure vetch. Cereal yield was highly correlated with the end contribution of legumes. The crop response after different legumes is similar, as long as the variety is well adapted to the area, but it's the legume persistence which varies, which agrees with what Ross was talking about previously. And the system benefits to cropping from successful pasture establishment phase can pay for establishment costs of a profitable pasture seed bank. So thank you very much for tuning in. And if you've got any questions for any of us, we'd be happy to answer.
Excellent. Thanks, Bonnie and Rick. Did we have any questions? I'm just checking my list.
Sure.
Looks like you are going to get off pretty easily there, but I won't let you off the hook completely. We might listen to Andrew's talk and then open it up for questions to all the speakers.
Yep. Sounds good.
Excellent. All right, great. Andrew, are you happy to jump into your presentation, giving an EP
Sure.
perspective?
Just a second, I'll just share the screen if I can find my right place to do that. Just bear with me just 1 second. Yeah, so what I'm going to talk about over the next, probably only take me 10 minutes, is what we learned as part of doing these demonstrations is for the LIPS project. Over the course of the 3 years, we did ranger trials and demonstration strips with growers, and most of those were focused in the low to medium rainfall area of Lower Eyre Peninsula. So it was confined by the project's restrictions, where we're working in pretty much anything from 350 mil rainfall and below. And so what we learned, so we're going to talk about what we learned through that, and also some of the discussions that I've had with growers about what they're trying to achieve with their pasture systems. So yeah, pastures do form a fairly important part of the farming system in that part of the world. And that's for a variety of reasons. So growers in those areas are looking to manage livestock and utilise the high prices that they can get from grazing at the moment. But really how they choose to do that is dependent on how their farming system operates. And I'm going to talk a little bit about where pastures fit into the farming system, and that really does depend on the grower's attitude and aptitude towards growing other broadleaf crops. And another thing that's increasingly become apparent in the last few years is with the increase in land prices, it's increasingly become evident that growers now, you can't just have some crappy piece of pasture ground growing whatever comes up and get some return on investment when your land's worth 1,000, 2,000, or even up to 7,000 in some places of Lower Eyre Peninsula now, dollars an acre. So there is this real drive to be able to get a return on investment for that land, and so for that to happen, you need to be able to have a pasture that's being productive, and so then you can graze animals effectively over that. And of course, lastly, what's really driving some growers really back into pasture systems at the moment is the cost of nitrogen. At $1,600 a tonne for urea, I think this morning. Yeah, nitrogen is a really big expense, and for growers that are pushing the system with multiple cereal crops even in that low rainfall area, nitrogen deficit's a real issue, and being able to fill the gap with a pasture is almost a no-brainer. So what I'm going to talk about really as part of what we learned out of these demonstrations is understanding where the pastures fit in the system. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we learned about vetch and medic and some of these alternative species, and really finish on weed control. That was sort of the Achilles heel from some of the work that we did last year, over the last 3 years. So this is where we focused our work. As I said, we deliberately restricted ourselves on Lower Eyre Peninsula to the medium rainfall, the low to medium rainfall area of the Lower EP. And we conducted, what I'm going to talk about now is the work that we conducted in the first year near Ungara, some trials that we ran over the course of the 3 years at Butler, and another smaller site that we ran near the coast at Lipson on some lower rainfall country there. So this is this question of where pastures fit into the farming system really does tie into what this Ungara grower was trying to achieve. So this guy here, in his pastures formed a really important part of his system because he wanted to have that flexibility in management options to control ryegrass. He also wanted to be able to, he had some fairly productive country that he could really turn some sheep off and make good money out of. So this guy in particular wanted to be able to bring sheep in. He didn't have a self-replacing flock. He wanted to be able to have a pasture that he could establish and turn sheep off annually But he also wanted the flexibility to be able to grow other broadleaf crops in that farming system. So, and so when that happening, whether you're growing beans is in this instance or canola as an alternative crop, when you've got a pasture species that's essentially competing with that as a broadleaf weed in those crops, self-regenerating species like Medic really start to struggle, and you're compromising one part of the system or another. And so that's where vetch really comes to the fore in these particular systems, where growers do want to have the flexibility to be growing other broadleaf crops. And in this system, and what we saw with this particular case is that the pasture production we got out of establishing vetch was certainly superior in terms of biomass. And this guy even tried a bit of tillage radish, and that added some more value, both in terms of pasture volume, but also the digestive value and the amount of energy that sheep were able to get from grazing that also improved compared to particularly the Medic and the Ceradella that we tried to establish in that site as well. So so understanding where pastures fit in the system was probably the first thing that really hit home to us as part of this experience. The next one I'm going to talk about the Butler trial that we ran. We firstly established a whole range of pasture species that you can see on the right-hand side of the screen there. Tried to establish them in 2019. And we established them in two different parts of the paddock, one on a sandy rise and one on a loamier flat. And what I've got there in the chart there, I sort of bastardized the statistics a little bit, but it holds true, is the amount of pasture production that we've got from the regeneration of those pasture species in 2021. So in 2019 we sowed, we got some pasture production, we grew cereal on there in 2020, and I was fairly kind with my broadleaf weed control in that cereal crop, where I was trying not to sacrifice any seed that was getting through, but most of what we saw in 2021 was just regeneration from the seed bank that was set in 2019. And what we saw is if I bulk all of those, what we're calling alternative pasture species, so anything other than Medic and vetch, into one box and compared that to Medic and vetch, you can see that those alternative pasture species in their regeneration capacity in 2021 was lower than what we saw in the vetch and the Medic. And I think the large reason behind that was because of our ability to control broadleaf weeds in those species in 2019. Now, I probably could have got a bit gung-ho and tried to control some cape weed in those species, but there wasn't much registered and there wasn't a lot of information about what I could have sprayed on those species. And and they didn't perform, they didn't compete well. And so one of the take-homes for me out of that was that if we are going to establish these alternative pasture species, we do need to have a plan on how we control broadleaf weeds in that, and whether that's coming out of a background with very low broadleaf weed issues, or we do have some options to control in that pasture phase. And so this sort of lends me on to, I think this is almost my last slide, is the trial that we ran at Lipson. So we grew these 4 different pasture species in blocks in 2020. So we thought it was a fairly crappy regenerating pasture. So it's one of these ones that is getting a bit of a free ride. It hasn't been regenerated for a number of years, but a bit of Medic did come up and ended up producing some reasonable biomass. We also had some sprayed off whatever did come up when we established some vetch, some salt and Medic, and some Margarita. And what you're seeing here in this, some Margarita Ceradella. And so what you're seeing here is the wheat yield following those pasture species being established in 2020. So this is the wheat yield in 2021. And what this demonstrates is pretty much what you've just seen from Bonnie and Rick, is that if you have a really poorly producing pasture, it can certainly affect your wheat yield. And so, establishing the wrong thing can effectively cost you money. And while we did mineral nitrogens at the start of last year, we didn't detect any significant differences, but I would suggest that that would be the result of nitrogen being mineralised during the growing season at different rates, just because of that really poor pasture growth that we got out of the Margarita in 2020. So that was essentially it. I do want to thank both the crew that I have here working at EP Ag Research and all of the growers that helped us out with both sowing demonstrations and allowing us to use their property for some of the trials. So I'm going to stop sharing there, Naomi, and hand it back to you.
Excellent, thanks Andrew. It's always nice when the messages line up across multiple presentations. We didn't plan that at all beforehand, so that's good. Did we have any questions for Andrew or any of the other speakers while we're here?
Andrew, I'll ask. Can I jump in with a question for Andrew?
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you, Rick.
It was about the length of, I mean, you're comparing, vetch and medic. So the length of the medic pasture phase, I mean, how often are you seeing single year medic phases? Obviously the vetches are nearly always 1 year.
Yeah, fairly typically the pasture phase is only 1 year, but in the areas that I work, I can't recall seeing anyone leave a paddock, go to pasture for more than that. Yeah, Rick, you can, and maybe that benefit needs to be sold if there is one there.
So that's relying on more regular resowing, I guess. So what's the resowing frequency that you'd expect then?
Yeah, and again, it depends on what the farmers, where their goal is. What I've seen happen, particularly in the last 5 or 6 years, is this more of this attitude towards growing alternative broadleaf crops. And so there has been this compromise in what you're doing in establishing the more traditional pasture species like medic, and that sort of disappeared. There's been a big increase in what I've seen in the area that we're talking here in growing vetch. Vetch has just become a really good stopgap. You can put it in at reasonably low cost and achieve the biomass production that you need to get decent grazing and the flexibility that you're not worrying about controlling it in another broadleaf crop. And so that's where the compromise has been. I would say that medic production has declined across that probably the last 5 to 7 years.
I have a question for Rick. Rick, what surprised you most, if anything, about how the economics fell out?
Well, I guess, it shouldn't be a surprise because we had a pretty good example at Lameroo there where, I mean, you could get your payback even without that grazing value and gain that seed bank, which has advantage, especially on the farm we're on there, which has a lot of livestock. So that shouldn't really be a surprise, but it was good to see actually that you could just on that nitrogen benefit, because we've got such end hungry cropping systems these days that, like Bonnie showed in those results, it really is end driven. So there was a lot of advantage there. So that was a good result. I mean, it needs good establishment. That's the challenge, of course. I guess the other surprise, I mean, so some of these other options, pasture options, or what Andrew called alternatives, that they've sort of had their moment across the whole project. Like there's might just be one trial site across the 2 states where it's performed really well. So it'll just be interesting to see in the future whether that can be more consistent, and then you could really gain some confidence to recommend them, I guess.
Same question for you, Ross. Anything surprise you about the project overall? Or do you know it all along?
I guess one surprise for us was that when we started out, we actually thought that the whole concept of summer sowing medics was implausible, but it has shown some potential at some sites. And so we think there is opportunity to, if we can understand how to better harvest medic pod, then there's still may be some opportunity to improve the adoption by doing that, and summer sowing. So that would be one surprising thing. I guess would be another one. A lot of the legumes, so long as they're reasonably well adapted, the crop performance after them has been quite similar. I would have thought at the beginning that we might have seen some greater variation between the legumes in terms of the crop performance, but we really haven't seen that, so long as they go reasonably well in that environment. In terms of the choice of legume species, it's more not so much their impact on the wheat crop, but how they persist in the longer term. That's probably where we're seeing things fall over. So at Minipa, for example, we had 6 legumes there. The wheat yield was pretty similar and higher protein on all the legumes, but when we came back out of the cropping phase, it was really only the medics that persisted, and that's been true of the demo trials as well. So that's, I think that's one interesting observation that we've learned.
Naomi, there's just a question there in the chat from Josh. He was asking what the vetch sowing rate was, and we used 40 kilos per hectare. He also asked about the seed of the was the Ceradella emergent similar to what we've seen in WA? And I am not across those numbers from WA at the moment, but I'm not sure if Ross or David can comment on that. I'll leave space for you to.
Yeah, look, I couldn't really make comment other than to say that across a range of trials, the Ceradella has established reasonably well. I don't think the summer sowing has necessarily been better than the autumn sowing for the Ceradella in our trials. I think the issue with the Ceradella is more around its longer term persistence. Whether it can actually get through 2 or 3 cropping years and still come back, I doubt that very much. That's the Achilles heel of it.
Probably worth mentioning too that we started off a few years ago, so we didn't have access to Freno, Ross, the newer variety. And if we started now, we'd probably be using that, and maybe that's got a different flowering you might want to mention.
Yep. So that's reputedly 2 weeks earlier flowering and higher hard seed levels. So that certainly swings the balance towards its regeneration in those systems. And look, in some environments on the deep sand, Ceradella has just grown extremely well. So I think we shouldn't also discount it totally. And there's probably some further opportunity for development in the time of flowering and hard seed space beyond Freno, I would think.
Yep. And then the other part of the question was, what weed issues did the summer sowing generate? And so across the experiments, we did weed counts for all the establishment methods, and at 2 of them there was more weeds under summer sowing compared to twin sown, and we think that's because you're disturbing the soil in the summer, so that's generating some more weeds than the twin sown where the seeds already sitting there from the previous season. So that was the main finding there.
Okay, we might leave it there. You got a nice comment from Alan in Western Australia. He's an agronomist over in the Eastern Wheat Belt. He's very happy to be able to participate in here. I think he's jumped off now. So I just want to thank the speakers very much for their efforts in the preparation. A lot of work goes behind the scenes in getting these things going, so thank you. And Ross, you did mention before when we spoke that you're happy for people to contact you or David directly to talk about species if anyone wants some specific information. Can I put that in my newsletter so that anyone can call you?
Yep, that's fine.
Excellent.
Yeah, so look, if any, I mean, just by its nature today, this is sort of very general overview of the program, but if people want specific recommendations, by all means, contact David or myself, and we'll sort of have a deeper discussion about soil types and what they're seeking to get out of their pastures and make some recommendations around that. No problems.
Excellent. And we recorded today, and if that has all worked okay, I hopefully will be able to put this up for people to access too, but I'll let people know through the newsletter that that's an option. So I think that's all I need to do. Thank you to the funders, and thank you very much for the people that have participated. Thanks for jumping on. This is the first virtual workshop that AREP have run specifically. So as our tester, and yeah, I think it's gone pretty well. So thanks very much.
Good job, Naomi.
Okay, thanks for hosting, Naomi.
Yeah,
That's great.
thanks everyone.
Yes.
See ya.
Yes.
See ya.
Okay, see
Good
ya.
luck.
Bye.
See ya.